They need you fragmented, not as a conspiratorial statement, as a structural observation. A fragment is malleable. A fragment responds. A fragment occupies the space it's given without asking whether that space is what it would have chosen. A human being with a coherent center is much harder to move. A human being who doesn't know where their own center is will go wherever the context demands. You know this, not as theory, as lived experience. You walk into a room and something in you shifts before you even open your mouth. It's not conscious adaptation, it's automatic. The right repertoire for the right environment arrives before the thought does. And when you leave, another version steps in, then another. And at some point during the day, usually in a gap, in a silence between one thing and the next, you stop, and for a fraction of a second, you don't know which one of them is really you. That moment, that fraction of a second, that's what we're going to talk about. There is a difference between adapting and dissolving, and you've already started to feel that difference, even if you haven't been able to name it yet. Every person adapts to contexts. That is basic social competence, not an existential crisis. You speak differently with your mother than with your co-workers. The register shifts, the vocabulary shifts. That is intelligence, not fragmentation. What we are diagnosing here is different. It's the feeling that there is no stable self beneath the adaptations, that the versions aren't layers of the same person. They are pieces of different people coexisting without hierarchy, without a center, without a fixed point that says, here, this is me, regardless of what the environment demands. Have you ever received a compliment you couldn't actually receive? One that slid right through you without taking root, as if the person being praised wasn't real enough to absorb it? Have you ever been described by someone who knows you well and recognized the description, but didn't see yourself in it? Have you ever wondered, at the end of a long day, whether anything you said or did that day was genuinely yours, or whether it was simply the set of responses each situation required? These questions are not a sign that you are becoming unstable. They are a sign that you are beginning to perceive a structure that has always been operating. Observe the pattern in your own movements with clinical precision. A performance review meeting. You arrive with a version of yourself you know well. Competent, articulate, strategic, measured in your criticisms, efficient in the expected language. You don't need to rehearse. That version already knows what to do. You leave the meeting and go to lunch with an old friend. The previous version exits without ceremony and another takes its place. More direct, more informal, with opinions the first one would never have expressed. That evening, a call from the family. Third version. Son, sibling, the person the family needed you to be while you were growing up, and that you still perform with precision 2 decades later. 3 versions in a single day, each one coherent within its context. Each one recognizable to those who know you in that register, and none of them, if you're honest with yourself, the version you would choose to be if no one were watching and no context were demanding anything. The question is not which of the 3 is false. Probably none of them is entirely false. The question is, where is the center that organizes them? Where is the self that decides when to use each version, instead of being used by them? For most people, the honest answer is uncomfortable. There is no organizing center. There is a set of versions that operate on a rotating basis as the environment demands. And what looks from the inside like a complex and adaptable personality is structurally the absence of a center. This has a name. And Nietzsche formulated it with a clarity that will reorganize what you understand about your own self. So where does this fragmentation come from? If you're not a hypocrite, and you probably aren't, if you're not consciously constructing false versions of yourself to manipulate different contexts, where does this centerless multiplicity come from? The answer is not in you, it is in the system you inhabit, in what it rewarded, in what it penalized, in what it needed from you at each stage of life, and in what it never at any point asked you to be. There is a philosopher who spent his entire life diagnosing the state of those who never affirmed their own values, who simply reacted to the values the world around them presented, internalized external expectations as if they were internal choices, and arrived at maturity as a figure of high competence and low coherence. He didn't call that weakness, he called it a cultural disease, and it is far more widespread than you imagine. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in the 19th century, but the phenomenon he dissected has a disconcerting contemporary relevance, as if he had observed the 20th and 21st centuries from a window that time had not yet closed. Nietzsche was not a philosopher of consolation. He was a philosopher of diagnosis. He observed the culture around him, the collapse of religious certainties, the rise of bourgeois conformism, the multiplication of values that no one had truly chosen, and described it with a precision his contemporaries found unbearable. Most people do not live. They react, and they call that reaction a life. For Nietzsche, existing genuinely meant one specific thing: having affirmed your own values. Not inherited them, not absorbed them through cultural osmosis, not adopted them because the environment rewarded that adoption, but chosen, tested, sustained in the face of real resistance. The human being who never went through that process, who grew up, built a career, constructed relationships, and a reputation entirely from values that arrived from outside without serious questioning, that human being, for Nietzsche, is what he called reactive, not in the sense of weak or cowardly. In the precise, technical sense, a self that defines itself by what it is not, by what others expect, by what the context demands. A mirror with no backing, something that reflects but emits no light of its own. And what contemporary culture produced, with an efficiency that Nietzsche could not have anticipated in detail, but that fits perfectly within his diagnosis, is an infrastructure of multiplying reactive surfaces. Every new environment demands a new version. Every new demand molds a new layer. And the center, if there even is one, becomes more and more buried beneath the adaptations. Nietzsche would call this reactive nihilism. And he would say it is not the dramatic collapse of values that the word nihilism popularly evokes. It is the silent, functional, and absolutely invisible state of someone who never became anyone, of someone who responded to everything and affirmed nothing. This state has a precise geometry, and it is operating in you right now as you listen to this. Let's open the mechanism with surgical attention. Nietzsche distinguished between two fundamental types of existence. Not between the successful and the failed, not between the intelligent and the mediocre, but between those whose vital energy moves towards something, who affirm, who build, who choose, and those whose vital energy functions in a mode of permanent opposition or adaptation, who define what they are by what they are not, by what the other is not, by what the context asks them to be. This distinction is not moral, it is structural, and it is more relevant than it appears at first glance. Think about how you built what you call your identity. You have values. You can probably articulate them if someone asks. Honesty, competence, loyalty, quality. The specific set varies, but there is a set. The question Nietzsche would ask, and it is a genuinely uncomfortable one, is, did you choose those values, or did you inherit them because they were the values your environment rewarded? The child who grows up in an environment that values productivity above all else learns that productivity is a genuine value, and internalizes the demand for performance as if it were a personal conviction, not an absorbed environmental pressure. The person who grows up in an environment where social approval is high-value currency learns that being accepted matters, and carries that learning as if it were character, not conditioning. The professional who is shaped in an environment where a particular set of behaviors is rewarded develops those behaviors and calls them personality. None of this is individual fault. It is the way culture transmits values, not as proposals to be examined and accepted or rejected, but as assumptions that arrive before the capacity to question them and install themselves as if they were natural. The problem for Nietzsche is not that you inherited values. Every human being inherits values. There are values that arrive before consciousness, and no philosophical reflection will completely erase them. The problem is when the totality of what you call I is formed by unexamined inheritances. When there is not a single point on your map of values that you can point to and say, this I tested, questioned, and chose to sustain for reasons that are my own. When that doesn't exist, when the self is entirely constructed by absorption and adaptation, with no center affirmed from the inside out, what you have is not an identity. It is a highly calibrated system of responses for multiple contexts, functional, competent, completely hollow at the center. And the fragmentation you feel is not the consequence of having too many versions. It is the consequence of having no center to decide which version to use. A mirror with no backing lets the light pass through instead of reflecting it. It doesn't function as a mirror. It shows nothing of itself, only transmits what comes from outside. Nietzsche used the image of the reactive person to describe exactly this. The human being who has never affirmed a single value of their own is transparent to the demands of the environment. They let everything pass through. They mold themselves, adapt, reformat, and from the outside they look like a person of great social versatility. From the inside, when the noise of the environment stops, there is a question with no easy answer. What here is mine? The fragmented self is not a divided self. It is a self that never closed around anything it chose. A self without a center is extraordinarily useful to systems that need quick responses and constant adaptation. The job market doesn't ask you to be someone. It asks you to deliver. The social environment doesn't ask for internal coherence. It asks for conformity to the register. The family doesn't ask you to be authentic. It asks you to be the role you learn to occupy since childhood. Each of these systems is perfectly served by fragmentation. None of them has a structural interest in your internal coherence. You fragmented are more malleable, more available, more responsive. Nietzsche would say, reactive nihilism is not a failure of the system. It is one of its most useful products. Fragmentation is not an accident. It is a convenience. The word mediocre has been hijacked by popular language and glued to the idea of incompetence. That is not what Nietzsche meant. For him, mediocrity was the state of someone who exists in the middle, neither here nor there, neither affirming nor denying, neither building a self nor entirely abandoning the illusion of having one. The mediocre person, in the Nietzschean sense, can be highly competent, widely recognized, productive, and socially valued. What they are not, themselves. They exist as a weighted average of the expectations around them, as the resultant of the forces that shape them. The identity fragmentation you feel is not the failure to build who you are. It is the state of someone who never began that construction, because the system around them never needed it to happen. Now the diagnosis must deepen to where it truly hurts. Identity fragmentation is not a recent phenomenon. Nietzsche described it in the 19th century as a characteristic of the European culture of his time, a society that had lost its traditional anchors of meaning, religion as an organizing meta-narrative, community as a definer of clear roles, tradition as a transmitter of values without ambiguity, and that had replaced those anchors with nothing, with a void filled by activity, convenience, and conformism. What the contemporary era did was industrialize that process on a scale and at a speed without historical precedent. Think about how identities are constructed today. You don't just have the family environment, the school environment, and the professional environment, the three contexts that shaped most identities for centuries. You have multiple simultaneous environments, each with its own grammar of values, its own criteria for approval, its own demands about who you should be within them. The job market asks for one version. Your family of origin asks for another. The family you built asks for a third. Your old friends know a fourth. Your co-workers know a fifth. And beneath all those surfaces, when the day ends and the noise quiets down, a question remains: which one is the center? The contemporary system is not neutral on this question. It has a stake in the outcome. A fragmented self is a self that can be captured by multiple systems at the same time. It can be a consumer in several registers, a worker in multiple formats, a participant in multiple communities, each one receiving a version calibrated to its expectations. A self with a coherent center, one that has affirmed its own values and sustains them in the face of opposing pressure, is a much harder self to capture. It says no more often. It leaves environments that contradict what it is. It is less malleable, less responsive, less useful to systems that depend on constant adaptation. Fragmentation, from the perspective of the systems you inhabit, is not a problem to be solved. It is a resource to be exploited. Nietzsche did not frame this in terms of markets. He framed it in terms of culture and will. But the logic is the same. A culture that needed coherent and affirmative selves would build structures that favored the formation of those selves. The culture you inhabit has built over decades structures that multiply surfaces, divide attention, and fragment the narrative of who you are becoming across multiple simultaneous micro-contexts. Not out of malice, out of systemic logic. The fragment is more useful than the center, and the feeling you have of not knowing who you are, of recognizing the versions but not the core, is not the symptom of a personal crisis you need to resolve. It is the expected and predictable response of a human being who has inhabited for long enough a system that never asked them to be anyone, only to respond. We've reached the core of the diagnosis, and it is more disturbing than what came before. The identity fragmentation you carry is not the result of a personal failure to build who you are. It is the logical and structural result of a system that never needed you to build who you are. That needed instead quick responses, constant adaptation, and permanent availability. Nietzsche had a name for this state: reactive nihilism. And what he described as a cultural diagnosis for the 19th century is, in the contemporary era, a product of infrastructure. It was built systematically, with functional precision, not against you, but with no interest whatsoever in you as a center, only in you as a surface of response. The inversion the diagnosis demands is this: you are not fragmenting, you were fragmented. Not by identifiable enemies, not by a conspiracy with a face, but by the logic of systems that function better with malleable pieces than with coherent people. The market functions better when you can be redefined with each cycle of demand. The social environment functions better when you can be summoned in any register without resistance. The family functions better when you keep playing the role you learned to occupy, regardless of who you are becoming. None of those systems ever asked you at any point to affirm your own values, to test what you believe in the face of real resistance, to hold a position when the context was pushing in the opposite direction. And without that process, which Nietzsche called affirmation, and which is the structural opposite of reactive nihilism, what remains is exactly what you feel: versions without a center, adaptations without roots, an extraordinary performance competence, and a question that never closes. Who here, at the center of all this, are you? That question is not defeat. It is the first one worth asking, because until now, the system around you never needed you to ask it. Now the phenomenon is completely readable. The identity fragmentation you experience is not a problem of self-knowledge. It is not a lack of therapy, reflection, or sufficient pauses to find yourself. It is the structural and predictable consequence of decades spent inhabiting systems that reward the useful version of you and are indifferent to everything else. You are not getting lost. You were never found by a system that needed you as a center, only as a surface. Nietzsche spent a significant portion of his work describing what he called transvaluation, the process by which a human being examines the values they inherited, questions their origin, tests their sustainability against the real pressure of life, and decides, not out of convenience, not out of conformism, not for approval, what they will affirm as their own, not as a self-help program, as a diagnosis of the only process that can produce a coherent self, the examination of the values you carry, and the active decision about which of them are genuinely yours. This process is rare, it is uncomfortable, and no system around you has any particular interest in your doing it. Quite the opposite. Every system around you has an interest in your remaining available for the versions it needs. Fragmentation is not the natural state of the human being. It is the natural state of the human being inside a system that needed them fragmented. That distinction, once seen, cannot be undone. Look back with this diagnosis active and see what it reorganizes. Every version of you that exists today, the professional, the son or daughter, the friend, the partner, the participant in every environment you inhabit, was calibrated over time by feedback. What worked was reinforced. What generated resistance was softened or eliminated. What the context rewarded became behavior. What the context penalized was archived. This process is automatic. It required no consciousness. It required no decision. It happened the same way the language you speak happened, through immersion, repetition, and reinforcement, before you had the tools to examine what was being inscribed. The result, decades later, is a human being of high contextual competence and low central coherence. Someone who knows exactly what each environment expects and delivers it with precision, who rarely disappoints on the surface, and who, in moments of silence, feels an opacity about themselves that no external recognition can dispel. Nietzsche did not see this as destiny. He saw it as a starting point for a question, not the question of how to become more authentic. That is the language of self-help and falls outside the vocabulary of this diagnosis. But the prior and more fundamental question, Have you, at any point in your life, affirmed something as your own? Not because the context demanded it, not because someone would approve, not because it was the expected answer, but because you examined it, tested it, and decided it was true for you? If the answer is no, or if the answer is I don't know, you are in full reactive nihilism, and the system around you will continue to function perfectly with you in that state. It was designed for that. There is an image Nietzsche used frequently: the camel, the lion, and the child. 3 metamorphoses of the spirit. The camel carries. It accepts every burden that is placed upon it and transports them with diligence. It is the spirit that says yes to everything the world demands, that internalizes duties, expectations, and external values as if they were natural. Most of the well-functioning people you know are at the camel stage. Productive, adapted, competent, and completely formatted by the weight they carry without having chosen it. The lion denies. It transforms "you must" into "I want." It questions the burdens. It refuses the ones that aren't its own. It is the movement of rupture, necessary but still reactive. The lion still needs something to oppose. The child, the third stage, affirms, creates. It is movement without prior negation, without opposition, without the need for another in order to define itself. The spirit that has reached the child is no longer defined by what it refuses or by what it carries. It is defined by what it has built as its own. Nietzsche did not say that everyone reaches the child. He said that most people remain the camel forever, functional, competent, socially approved, and entirely formatted by the exterior. The question that remains, with no answer I can give you, if no one asked anything of you anymore, if every system around you fell silent at the same time and the demand disappeared, which version would remain? Not the one you'd wish would remain, not the one you'd present if you were choosing, the one that would actually remain, with no audience, no context, no reward. Nietzsche spent his life believing that this was the most important question a human being could ask, and that most people never truly got around to asking it. You are asking it now. Nietzsche offers no consolation at the end, and neither will this screenplay, because the diagnosis you just heard resolves nothing. Naming the mechanism doesn't deactivate it. Seeing the structure doesn't dismantle it. You can finish this video with complete clarity about the fragmentation you carry and continue tomorrow, delivering the same versions to the same contexts that demand them. That too would be a form of response, a choice, even if it didn't feel like one. What changes? The only thing that changes, with structural lucidity, is that the opacity about the mechanism disappears. You can no longer call fragmentation a complex personality without knowing deep down that you are using that word to avoid asking the hardest question. You can no longer call constant adaptation emotional intelligence without realizing that you use that phrase to avoid examining what is at the center, or whether there is anything there at all. Antidote doesn't give you the Nietzschean child. It doesn't give you the coherent self. It doesn't give you the center you may have never built. It gives you the question the system never needed you to ask. If that question stayed with you, if it's unsettling you right now in a way that won't simply pass, subscribe to the channel. The next video is already being prepared.